Dr. Joe Watso, you're one of the leading experts in the field of VO2 max, blood pressure, all kind of things associated there. I want to do a deep dive into VO2 max so people really have an understanding of what it is, why it's important, how we can potentially increase it, how we can measure it. So can you just give just a general overview to start? Like, what is VO2 max? What is the basic explanation of VO2 max?
Yeah, so first of all, thankfully, invitation to come here and speak. It's really cool. So VO2 max, just broadly, is the most amount of oxygen that your body can consume, and it's expressed in a rate, so per minute. So how much oxygen can you take in from the atmosphere and use for metabolism in the body? And that's linked to a lot of things related to longevity and performance and other things that we'll get into.
So first off, like, how is it generally measured? Like, what are they looking at? Just the total volume of oxygen that you're taking in, obviously via stress test?
Yeah, that's the most common way to do it, typically on a treadmill. So you'll start at a low intensity and then increase to a medium and a higher intensity until you can't go any longer. And what happens at the end of the test is that eventually the amount of oxygen that you're consuming per minute, so that is oxygen that you're taking in from the atmosphere, and your exhaled breath has less oxygen. And the difference between the two is simply the oxygen uptake. And that amount plateaus at the end of a test, and that's your VO2 max, your maximal aerobic capacity.
So can people sometimes be limited, like biomechanically, by like achieving their ultimate VO2 max? Because I know there's like different ways of testing it, like running or bike, or like if someone has a limitation where they like are fatiguing more mechanically before they hit their actual VO2, is that a thing, or does it really not matter that much?
So the classical studies would suggest that you do need to have a treadmill test, and you need to have an incline specifically because that activates the most muscles in the body. And obviously that'll drive up the VO2 max value because you have more active skeletal muscle. But obviously if you have mobility limitations, there's certainly still a lot of information that can be gained from a cycling test or even a recumbent cycling test as opposed to an upright. And they have normative data on that as well. So you can still get a value on a cycling VO2 max test and put yourself at 30th, 50th, or 80th percentile, whatever that is, based on how your value lines up with thousands of data sets.
One of the things that I think people might get hung up on with VO2 max is they think this is only a performance marker. Like, it's only something that's going to tell them how they're going to perform at the Olympics, or how they're going to measure up against their buddy in a race or something. But VO2 max is a lot more than just that. In fact, it's predominantly more than just that. I mean, just given what you do, and maybe describe a little bit what you do, sort of even in a clinical setting, and how this might look with VO2 max. Like, what are some of the benefits of a higher VO2 max? Like, what do you see just in regular life?
After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT electrolytes, and now, in case you haven't seen it, they have their sparkling electrolytes, like an actual can, a ready-to-drink can of electrolytes in a sparkling fashion. So it tastes like a soda, but you're getting the electrolyte effect. So if you're in a caloric deficit, you're trying to cut, or you're trying to build muscle but stay lean at the same time, these things are amazing because you can sip on them during your workout and it feels like you're sipping on a soda, but you can also sip on it throughout the day and it just tastes really good. But they still have the same 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium. Totally fasting friendly. They won't break a fast. You could have them before your fasted workout. They also have their regular packs, which of course I still use all the time. Like, that's my baseline. But anyway, that link down below gets you a free variety pack with any purchase. So free variety pack. All you got to do is make a purchase and you get a sample variety pack with each flavor. So you got like a citrus salt, which is like lemon lime. You've got a watermelon salt. You've got a grapefruit salt, all these really good flavors. So that link, go to drinklmnt.com/Thomas, drinklmnt.com/Thomas, and it's in the top line of this description. Make sure you check out their sparkling flavors.
Yeah, so I think an easy way to think about it is just sort of stress tolerance, but in this case, it's a physical or physiological stress. So that is, how high is your ceiling? And that'll increase the amount of things that you can do that are submaximal. So for example, if you need to catch a flight and you had to go across the airport in 5 minutes, could your body deal with the stress of running for 5 minutes with a bunch of luggage? And if your VO2 max is high enough, you can deal with that stress. And if you were not trained, your VO2 max was not as high, you would have a challenge for that. Or you might be working at your maximal oxygen capacity, just doing a lighter aerobic activity. But it is linked to longevity. There's a lot of things that are related to past just performance.
So what about things that maybe aren't super, super physical, but just matter for stress resilience, right? Like maybe running through the airport with a bunch of luggage, yeah, that's going to be like physically taxing and your resiliency and your ability to deal with that stress. But is there any link with VO2 max and just resiliency overall? Like, I mean, does it help your ability to say just handle overall stress with like a myriad of different things, whether it's some physical, some mental, it's just your overall stress load?
I think it depends. It comes down to the organ level. So for example, if you are having a lot of psychological stress and your heart rate goes up, and it could be that the training over time that increases your VO2 max is obviously training a lot of other tissues, and your heart has adapted to deal with higher stress, so higher heart rates. So that might be one example. But yeah, I'm not sure about too much else for that standpoint.
It's just, I always try to think about, okay, like at the end of the day, like we're exercising for resilience and a lot of different things, and kind of being able to increase our tolerance is probably hard to measure directly with data with VO2 max, but it would lead me to believe that, yeah, to a certain degree, like your ability to, like all these things get factored in, right? Like even if that sprint across the airport didn't seem to be affecting you in that moment, perhaps it's affecting your, allostatic load throughout the rest of the day, right? So with all these other things. But you were describing something earlier before we were filming about kind of the flow of oxygen and where oxygen ultimately gets. So I think that was a really good explanation, and I'd like you to share that, just explaining how that relates with VO2 max, because it really simplified it, like where oxygen is going and kind of these rate limiting steps within there.
Yeah, so it's termed the Oxygen Cascade, but basically you just imagine that you're an oxygen molecule going through the body. So obviously you start in the atmosphere, so you're just floating around, inhaled, and has to go through the lungs. So obviously that the first checkpoint is sort of getting through the lungs and being exchanged into the blood. And obviously once you're in the blood, then the heart's responsible for pumping that out throughout the body to get to the skeletal muscle that's active. And so blood vessel function obviously becomes important. The amount of the function of your heart with how well it can pump blood throughout the body matters. And then once you get to the tissue level, the skeletal muscle, you have the interaction where you have the oxygen actually extracted from the hemoglobin molecule that's bound to in the blood and actually gets pulled into the muscle for aerobic metabolism. And from there along that cascade, basically the VO2 max is just a checkpoint with all those things working properly. So for example, if everything was functioning great, but your muscle for whatever reason was not taking that oxygen from the blood vessels, from the hemoglobin, then that would reduce your VO2 max, and that'd be a therapeutic target for something that you would want to improve. The same way that if you had heart failure or you had an inability for your heart to pump blood throughout the body, that could be a limiting factor. So I think a VO2 max is really nice because it's an integrative measure of your full cardiopulmonary physiology with how well it can deal with stress.
Yeah, I've never really looked at it like that because there's a lot of different sort of factors that could become disrupted there, right? The obvious one that people might think of first is like, yeah, if your lungs aren't working well or you're congested or something, that's obviously going to affect it. That's probably where most people's thoughts kind of stop on VO2 max. It's like lungs, they don't really think of that, right? And then of course, further down the line, you might have other people that understand, okay, yeah, if your heart's not healthy, then sure, you're not going to be able to pump it very well. But I don't think people look at the sort of the metabolic side either, right? They don't necessarily understand that if you're metabolically dysfunctional or you're not able to extract that oxygen and utilize it and properly turn it into ATP, then that's going to affect your VO2 max. It's not just this independent, isolated thing. And I've never looked at it like that either. So it's like VO2 max is a really nice like cardiopulmonary and even metabolic sort of marker.
Right, exactly. It just pulls us all together and finds your basically weakest link in the chain. And the good part about an integrative VO2 max test where you're measuring all these things is it's not always the case, but sometimes you can find what the limiting factor might be. And that could be what you want to target for specific training or anything you do with health. And then just add another spin to, with oxygen, for example, other things that could impact it, like obviously the heart is pumping, and the heart itself, the cardiac tissue needs oxygen itself. So if you have poor blood flow to the heart muscle specifically, then that could become a limiting factor. And that's how you get into things that are that might impair that, would impair VO2 max as well.
How would you go about finding where the limiting factor is? So if you're hopping on a treadmill, you're doing a VO2 max test, you're not happy with the VO2 max score, Like, how do you reverse engineer from there, like where the actual problem is?
Yeah, there's a few things you could do. One thing that we do in the lab is something called a maximal voluntary ventilation test, which basically just means if we were sitting here right now without exercise, how much air could you move in and out of your lungs over the course of 10 to 15 seconds, and then we index that to a minute. So for example, my maximal voluntary ventilation might be 200 liters of air per minute. And during a VO2 max test, let's say I only get up to 100 or 150 liters per minute, then we know that the lungs are probably not a limiting factor for me. But if you have somebody come in and their maximal voluntary ventilation is 120 liters a minute, and you get them to do the exercise test and they hit 100, 110, or even approach 120 liters per minute, then that might be indicative that the lungs might be a limiting factor, because typically it should be 70% or below of what you can maximally ventilate at during an exercise test.
Interesting. So in your experience, is it common to have the lungs be the limiting factor, or in like today's day and age with sort of where we are metabolically as a whole in terms of population, are the lungs usually not the limiting factor?
Yeah, the lungs are usually not the limiting factor. I remember in undergraduate, I had a professor that said the lungs are like a Ferrari and everything else is trying to keep up. So in someone without any specific lung diseases or things that affect the function of the lungs, which is, I don't know statistics, but I guess for most people, it should not be a limiting factor typically.
That's wild. Yeah, I think it's so, because the quintessential thing that people will say when you are working out with them, or they'll say, oh, my lungs can't handle it. And I've always kind of thought, like, your lungs can handle it. It's like, it's like, oh, my lungs are weak. Like, it's just these like colloquial things we kind of say.
Yeah.
And this reality is like, the lungs are, I don't want to say they're simple, but I mean, they're just doing their job, right? So with that, if the lungs are already a Ferrari, is it worth sort of training the lungs, or are you better off sort of training the cardiovascular system and metabolic systems? I mean, where's the juice worth the squeeze, and where is it not? I mean, doing things like breath work, doing things like training those muscles, is that effective? Is it worth our time?
Yeah, I think it depends on the use case. So for VO2 max specifically, if it's not limiting factor, then strengthening the inspiratory or expiratory muscles during breathing may not have a big impact. But if you think about someone from a performance point of view, so you mentioned earlier about lining up at the race and knowing the VO2 maxes, and that'll be an indicator of performance. At the elite levels, VO2 max is going to be high in everybody, and it actually loses a little bit of predicted value because there's a lot of other things that go into it, which we can touch on later. But circling back to the respiratory muscles, obviously, like any muscle, if you want to train for, if you wanted to do a high volume of squats, the way to do that would be to train a lot of squats and get your body used to that. And if you want to train and work for a long duration at a high stress of your respiratory muscles, so heavy breathing for prolonged exercise, then it could be potentially beneficial because unlike other resistance training where you can target the quadricep and do leg extension or do calf raises, the lungs typically, or the respiratory muscles, only experience about a 40 to 50% of their peak capacity during pretty vigorous aerobic exercise. So they actually have trainers that you can increase the resistance. So when you inhale, there's a resistance dial, and that'll basically make it harder to breathe in. So you could think about breathing in through a straw of what that might feel like. And you could set that to, let's say, 75% of your peak inspiratory pressure, your peak inspiratory muscle strength. And by training at that higher load, obviously you have adaptation, probably some hypertrophy, but more importantly, maybe is you're just raising the bar and improving the efficiency of that muscle. So maybe it's less of a limiting factor with the long duration, heavy breathing exercise.
Is there like a mechanical change sort of that occurs? Like anyone that's like done intense exercise, like really pushed it hard, like upper aerobic into anaerobic, like with cardio specifically, there's a lot of movement that ends up coming through your entire core, really. And it's almost as if you could imagine like everything just kind of stretched, right? Like if you haven't worked out in a while, or you haven't pushed that intensity in a while, everything feels kind of constricted, right? And you can almost feel it. If you're truly breathing, belly breathing, you start to feel those things open up. And then once those things open up, it's almost as though you can reach that state a little bit easier. So from a mechanical perspective, do you notice that? Like even people that just haven't used those muscles or stretched that fascia, stretched that area, does that seem to impact their ability to breathe, even their VO2 max?
Yeah, I'm not so sure whether it impact the VO2 max value itself, because that should be independent of your respiratory muscle function, because again, it's just simply down to oxygen. But it could make it feel easier to breathe throughout that exercise test. And maybe at the end, instead of rating how out of breath you were out of maybe a 9 out of 10, maybe it's now a 7 out of 10. And we're actually using in the lab, and we think of this from the standpoint of, obviously, as you mentioned, when you're exercising really intensely, your breathing feels terrible. It feels like the limiting factor. It feels like you can't get air in sometimes. And obviously that varies between people. And part of what we think might be beneficial about the respiratory training is that maybe that alleviates that symptom associated with it. I don't know if I want to think about it as a symptom, but a byproduct of heavy exercises, you're going to feel out of breath. And if you train the lungs, specifically the respiratory muscles, to work at a higher capacity, let's say that 75%, when you're doing that intense exercise and only working at 40 or 50% of their capacity, that might feel easier. And maybe you go 10 seconds longer on your sprint, or maybe you're able to do an extra rep or something.
That's a good point, because sometimes it's that anyone that's ever pushed it to that max intensity, it's like the walls kind of close in on you when you're approaching that intensity, and all it takes is like that one little thing to like be the mental load that makes you stop, right? Like it's just like everything starts moving faster and faster. Like it's hard to describe, but like you're pushing at max intensity, and all of a sudden you're thinking about all the things that hurt, all the things that are bothering you, all the stresses in your life. And then all of a sudden you think about, oh shoot, I have to do the dishes when I get home. And that's enough to like make you quit, right? So sometimes it's the fact that if like you're having to have some level of mental load thinking about how hard it is to breathe, then that could be the limiting factor. That could be what makes you just throw in the towel.
Yeah, exactly. I know what you mean. You're pedaling away. All of a sudden your foot slips a little bit, and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. When you're already working at what you feel like is 110%. So yeah, we think about this right now. We have some studies ongoing in adults with obesity. So if you think about it from the mechanical point of view, if you have more tissue around the rib cage and below the diaphragm, so thinking about the visceral fat or central adiposity, you just have more tissue to move out of the way when you're exercising. And if you strengthen the muscles to do better at moving that mass, it could be that that's specifically for people with extra tissue around the rib cage or with obesity or central obesity. It could be beneficial. So an easy way to think about this is if you were to lie on your back and start breathing and then breathe heavy, think about how that would feel, and then take a 25-pound plate, lay that on your chest, and then try to do the same thing. You would obviously feel the difference with your rib cage having more difficulty expanding. And the respiratory training that we're doing hopefully should alleviate that. And that's a little bit of a far-fetched idea, but in reality, some people do have more or less mass around the rib cage and specifically below their diaphragm. So strengthening those muscles could make a difference for them.
So even the tiny little muscles in there can potentially counteract a fair bit of pressure and weight that's probably by volume more than those little muscles themselves.
That's what we think. The studies that we're doing are pretty early on. They're multi-year projects, and we're only a couple of years into them, but that's sort of the thinking behind it. So those are the things we're thinking about when we're testing these ideas.
And that's kind of liberating for people, because I think that especially people that struggle to lose weight and they're already having that struggle to begin with, and then they're kind of told that their VO2 max is important for longevity and all this and that. I mean, it's just, you got to put yourself in their shoes. That's a pretty kind of depressing thing sometimes. You're like, well, dude, I can't even get a breath, right? It's, does the same thing seem to apply with heavy musculature sometimes? Like you find I know a lot in even like the bodybuilding community, a lot of them suffer from sleep apnea, right? Just because there's a lot of weight, right? Even though they're not fat, there's a lot of weight. I would imagine that, having, all these muscles that sort of pull on this, big lats, all these things that would make it hard. Like have you noticed any of that? That's a small cohort, so maybe not, but have you seen any of that?
I've seen in the literature, there was one really neat study actually applying the respiratory training to people with obstructive sleep apnea. And obviously there's a whole array of things that are not optimal for physiology that take place. Obviously, being hypoxic when you sleep is not ideal, even for a short amount of time. So what they did was they had older people with obstructive sleep apnea undergo this respiratory training. And the one other neat thing that you talked about, barriers to exercise, the key ones that are most commonly cited are a lack of time is pretty common, inadequate access to facilities or equipment, and access to safe outdoor spaces. For example, if you obviously you can go outside and run, you can tell that to anybody, but some people may not have a park nearby or may not have a sidewalk or may not feel safe with that. So, and then specifically for some clinical populations, that breathlessness comes into view. So the neat thing about the respiratory training is that it only requires about 5 to 10 minutes per day. And you get some of the benefits of exercise. Obviously, there's still a ton of benefits for traditional aerobic and resistance training that you should still be sure to aim for overall. But you do get some benefits. In that particular study that I mentioned in people with obstructive sleep apnea, they had reductions in their resting blood pressure of about 10%, which worked out to somewhere around 12, 13, or 14 millimeters of mercury for systolic blood pressure, which is pretty remarkable, honestly, considering that a lot of antihypertensive medications may approach the 5 to 10 range for the initial treatment strategies. And some people are now resistant, and obviously there's a lot of interaction. So pretty remarkable cardiovascular health benefit through blood pressure reduction from that training. And it's obviously been applied to a lot of other populations, which we can talk on more.
That speaks volumes to going beyond just VO2 max or just ability to breathe, right? I mean, that's, if you're having that, what's happening upstream of that? Like, are you more parasympathetic? Are you more relaxed? Are you, like, all these other factors, right? So it's like, that's something that plays a big role, probably outside of just blood pressure. I mean, have you looked at anything else other than blood pressure on those? Like, any other markers change? Or is that just the sole focus in that case?
In that particular study, I can't recall exactly what they looked at, but there is other literature around this. And as I mentioned, all these things that I'm mentioning today from previous studies or ongoing studies are things that we're thinking about and including in our studies. We just don't have those preliminary results quite yet. But some things that have been shown to be beneficial. One example is the vascular endothelial health. So the cells that line the innermost layer of the vessels, their function has been shown to be improved, and that could be a driver of reductions in blood pressure, so relaxing the vessels more readily. And part of that may occur because of the increases in shear stress. So if you think about taking those big, deep breaths, you're causing big changes in the pressure in the lungs, and you're also driving a lot of blood flow from those big respiratory maneuvers. And that could be driving some of the vascular changes that are beneficial for blood pressure. And the other one, as you mentioned, the autonomic nervous system and parasympathetic, the hypothesis is that there is some benefit related to those big breaths as well, because you're activating the diaphragm. And it's an especially unique way because, as I mentioned, you really can't activate the diaphragm that way without external pressure. So if you wanted to do this at home, you could grab a straw and breathe in, and it would feel pretty tough. And that is a pretty unique stress that would probably add more motor activation to the diaphragm than you otherwise would normally probably encounter. And obviously there's this link between breathing and the autonomic nervous system. And there is some thought that the parasympathetic nervous system might become a little bit more active with you doing that. And in these studies, they actually use a control group that breathes at a much lower resistance, but does the same training every day. And the people who don't need to activate their diaphragm quite as much to produce as much pressure don't seem to be having some of these benefits. So that's kind of how we can partition out a little bit of why those benefits might be occurring.
Do you happen to know, like, roughly what percentage of your lungs or just close by you utilize when you're just like accessory breathing? You know, most of us, I shouldn't say most of us, who knows, but it seems as though a lot of us really just breathe. We're breathing here, right? You know, and no wonder we're all tense up here all the time, right? It's like we're just breathing through here. And I think almost anyone that has a decent amount of stress in their life can stop, pause, and think, like, yeah, I'm breathing through here. You know, or next time you get stressed out, be cognizant of where you're breathing, and you'll notice it. Like, is there literature to show, like, hey, you're using X% of your lungs when you breathe like that compared to X or compared to Y?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if the muscle activation patterns, I'm sure it's been done as far as what muscles are active during breathing. But like you said, especially for people that are, that might be working all day at a computer, and then your shoulders tend to creep up over time. So you do need to relax to keep your rib cage open. But yeah, there is this idea, especially this has been shown in people with obesity. Sometimes their lungs are quote unquote hyperinflated, which basically just means that instead of breathing from basically a moderate lung volume and increasing and decreasing from there, they tend to stay pretty full and have a more shallow breathing pattern, as you mentioned, sort of more so in the neck than pulling the diaphragm down and really breathing with those muscles. So in essence, I mean, we really should be
should we be fully emptying and fully inhaling, or is there always a kind of what percentage is there usually still relevantly or relatively active, like in like a 20% volume? Like I would imagine we don't completely empty our lungs, right? Like at least through regular breathing, maybe if you're making a concerted effort to completely empty your lungs, but I mean, you're usually maintaining 20 or 30% in there.
So let's just use an example of 5 liters. Let's say that your lung capacity is 5 liters. So if you inhaled fully, you'd have 5 liters of volume of air in your lungs. So that means that you're probably breathing somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5 is your sort of midpoint. And then from there, you breathe in and out about 500 mLs, which is half of a liter. So for this hyperinflation idea, you might be closer to like 4 liters and you're maybe breathing a little bit along that. But there is always a residual volume, so much as your lung has not collapsed, of about 1 to 1.5 liters. And obviously that varies between people. So even if you exhale completely until you're red in the face, keep exhaling. As long as everything's going okay with your lungs, you should still have about a liter or a liter and a half, because obviously then your lungs would be collapsed if you didn't have anything left.
During exercise, or particularly intense exercise, is there a difference in performance in someone that is really getting these deep inhalations and exhalations and having more overall volume exchange, so to speak, versus someone that's maybe a little bit more shallow? And I'm talking even at potentially an elite level, right? Like where maybe you've got someone that's maintaining, 2 or 3 liters and kind of exchanging off of that versus someone that's able to go all the way down to that 1 liter. Is there evidence there that one is better for performance, absent or sans like any really particularly shallow breathing? Because that obviously would suck.
Yeah. I'm not sure I could answer that directly, but obviously, as you alluded to, the respiratory frequency could become an issue. So let's say that you're exercising, you're breathing 30, 40, 50 times per minute from a moderate to a higher intensity. If you start moderate exercise, then you all of a sudden increase your breathing rate to 40, 50, 60. That's going to be a very inefficient way to breathe, because then you're not getting the stretch reflex. That's just sort of the natural recoil that occurs, and you're breathing so quickly that you're probably not able to breathe in as much as an efficient pattern.
Stretch reflex. Okay, that's interesting. It makes me wonder if a lot of times we're fighting that. Like, are we we're not able to relax enough to, even through exercise, right? I mean, we always kind of say, even in intense exercise, you're wanting to try to stay as relaxed as you can. Like the moment that you start to tense your grip on everything, things go to crap real quick. So that natural sort of stretch reflex, I find myself fighting that sometimes, because submitting to that and letting that just do its thing feels like you're losing control, right? I never really realized that existed, that there's a natural stretch reflex. Does that even occur if you're at a higher intensity with exercise, like just kind of getting that full breath and letting it go, or is that just at natural rest?
I'm not too sure. I think during exercise, as you mentioned, I think the mindset is you don't want to overthink it, because the lung will probably breathe in an efficient way. Mm-hmm. If you go into the mindset sometimes of you're trying to push as hard as you can, like you said, you're tense and everything, you're trying to control everything and control your breathing, you're probably going to be breathing inefficiently. Whereas if you just go into the mindset of I'm just going to be, slow as smooth and smooth as fast type of thinking, all of a sudden you'll find yourself I've had this occur for me where I'm running at a specific pace that I wouldn't think I would have ran that day, but it feels so easy that I've sort of second guessing what's going on, and I try not to overthink it and control, because then you jump into and you think, okay, well, am I breathing okay? I shouldn't be running this fast. Maybe I should start breathing heavier. This doesn't seem right. So that's a little bit more in the flow state, a little bit more psychological.
Yeah, as I say, there's probably a lot of that piece that comes into play there. Yeah. And also just where you're at that day. I mean, sometimes there's no... That's a good pivot into things that are somewhat out of our control. You mentioned some before we were filming about VO2 max and genetics, right? Mm-hmm. Some people are just genetically prone to a better VO2 max, which can be frustrating, but it's also, again, it's all a matter of perspective. It's also kind of liberating. It's like, okay, some people are just naturally going to have a higher VO2 max, and that's just the way that it is. You mentioned some studies that kind of looked at this. Can you explain those a little bit?
Yeah, so the way that they've partitioned this out is they've taken people that are twins, monozygotic, so the same genetics, versus others or siblings or people who share a household, for example. And there's obviously a range of variability between the studies, but I seem to recall that a larger majority of the variability in VO2 max is actually genetic. So that is let's say 40 to 70%. And there's obviously a range of values there. So that is when you come out of the womb, you might have a sort of predetermined set of where you might start with without training. But obviously there's still a trainability component. And again, there's a lot of variability with trainability, but let's just say most people could probably increase by 15, 20, 25%. Again, a little bit of variability there. So even if someone is, let's say when they're 20 years old, they have a VO2 max of 60, they're not trained, and someone else is, let's say, only at 40, they still have a capability to increase it quite a bit and maybe get closer to 50. So obviously, if both of them are going to be running races, one person's more likely to be an endurance athlete and not. But there is definitely a trainability component. That's what I think about and I focus on. And that's why my lab is really interested in the modifiable factors that can influence health. It's obviously super important to understand the non-modifiable factors, but I like to think of things that you can take action for and try to improve for yourself based on what your goals are.
Is the relative percentage of sort of trainability about the same? Like it's if someone's born with, let's just hypothetically say a set point of 40, this is a set point for lack of a better term, and someone has a set point of 50, like is the relative percentage of their ability to increase VO2 max about the same?
So there is a little bit of variability, and I seem to recall that somewhere in the 10 to 25% range, and on average maybe the 15 to 20% of what you could increase it by. Obviously that'll be influenced by where you start. So let's say you start at 45 and you've already been sort of training on the track team and everything, you may not be able to get another 20% with specialized VO2 max specific training. But if you're relatively sedentary and you're at 35, maybe you could jump all the way up to 50 because you're sort of quote unquote below that set point. So there's a lot of different factors at play.
Yeah.
But overall, in aggregate, that 20-ish% kind of comes up.
I mean, as much as it might be depressing for some people, the people that are born with a higher set point usually have a better ability to also train it even higher than those that don't.
I don't know if that's the case because they sort of have a higher ceiling. So I've seen a few VO2 max tests that are above 70 for VO2 max value, and one person who had an 80 that I've saw. And that individual, I don't think he was even actively running. He might have just been recreationally running a few times a week, which is just wild for me to think that even when I was training at my hardest, I don't think I broke 60. So if you come out and you're starting off in the 70s.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, it's. What about, if we pivot just to, longevity in a little bit. I know that's not necessarily your wheelhouse, so to speak, with research, but why does VO2 max seem to be such a strong predictor of lifespan?
Yeah, so I guess one statistic to just drive a little bit of the context for this. So I think there's some data suggesting that if you, this will get a little bit off topic, then I'll bring it back. If you break your hip, your mortality risk increases by about 50% in the subsequent 12 months. And why that might be is because you're not performing activities of daily living. You're unable to be a capacity for just normal independence. And there's a lot of other things that come along with sedentary behavior as a result of that. And when I talked about VO2 max earlier as distress tolerance, I guess for longevity, I think about this from the timeline. So if I'm going to be at 55, then I'll stick at 55, but I'm going to hold on as best I can over the next 50 years to make sure that my trajectory slope is not steep in a downward way. And when you think about the things that you want to do, for example, walking at 3 miles per hour, that requires a certain metabolic demand. And offhand, I want to say somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to 15-ish, although that might be a little bit off, of just walking 3 miles per hour of what that is for mLs per kg per minute. So we're talking about VO2 max, those are the units, but I'll just refer to the numbers. So if your VO2 max is 60, walking 3 miles per hour is no problem for you. If your VO2 max is 20, that's going to feel pretty difficult because if you think about what you train at 50% of your peak aerobic capacity, that feels relatively hard. So if that is what it's like for you to simply go to the bathroom or cook a meal, then that's going to make things pretty difficult for independence and all those things related to it with longevity.
That makes sense. I guess I've never really thought of everything. And again, I fall victim to this too. You think VO2 max and you just think maximum, like how hard are you pushing on everything? And I guess a follow-up question to that might help me come up with some other questions on this is, if I have a VO2 max of 60 and I am doing things like low, slow, zone 2, zone 3 training, am I doing work to maintain that VO2 max at all? I'm probably not pushing it and improving it. But if I were to just say, let's put it better. If I had an injury and I couldn't push it really hard, but I could still go walk on an inclined treadmill at 3 miles an hour and get a little bit of aerobic work that way, would I maintain some of that VO2 max better?
Then being sedentary, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dysfunction that can occur at the organ level when you're completely sedentary. And obviously there's a spectrum of the more active you are, the more likely you are. Obviously there's going to be less of a maintenance of VO2 max if you're not pushing quite as hard. But another way to think about training sometimes too is training is building more enzymes, and enzymes are what are going to drive the uptake and metabolism of oxygen. So mitochondrial efficiency and other things, you're still driving factors that contribute to the oxygen cascade, which is what we talked about. So you're still stressing the heart, so the heart is still getting stronger at pumping. That's still going to help the oxygen cascade. Theoretically, the lungs really shouldn't be declining, but even a low-level exercise should not have a negative impact on the lungs. So all those things are still sort of being held up in some way, maybe just not as quite directly, to drive increases in VO2 max.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me, because understanding the oxygen cascade actually just clears a lot of things up, right? Because you think like, okay, yeah, if you weaken the heart, then yeah, it makes things make a little bit more sense. With VO2 max, like if I'm at a 60 and I get injured and I start, walking on actually a better question with that. So in the world of building muscle and things like that, for example, there's muscle memory, right? Like if you're gonna have it's a different context of muscle memory, but it's essentially easier to get those gains back. That's not real muscle memory, but like we call it muscle memory, just kind of in a bro science way. Is there sort of a muscle memory, so to speak, with VO2 max? Like once you've achieved a high VO2 max, does it seem easier for those people to get back to that VO2 max? Like if I got myself up to a 70, I have about a 60, which is decent, but not amazing. But if I got up to a 70, would it be easier for me to get up to a 70 the second time or the third time if I had an injury and dipped down below 60 again?
From a pure physiology point of view, I'm not sure if that's the case. The classic Dallas bed rest heart study, I think I've heard Ben Levine talk about this. And this could be incorrect, but I'm pretty sure I recall that the people that did have the highest VO2 maxes after they underwent several weeks of bed rest were completely sedentary. I think they had a little bit more of a difficult time getting all the way back up. Because if you think about it, again, you're weakening so many chains.
For sure.
There's so many links in that chain, and each of them needs to be brought back. So I think from a physiological perspective, that would be what I would think would be the case. But obviously, you can open your training logbook, you know what you're going to do, you know how it feels, you know how to push through, you have the support system or the know-how to do it. I think that probably does make it easier, and that could probably offset it, but there's still going to be a physiological challenge to still get back up there because there's so many different things that are interacting.
Yeah, lots of different variables. I mean, if you're injured, it's a completely different story than if you're just switching training modalities or something like that. I guess that's where it's highly variable. If you switch from, I was running a lot at this time and my VO2 max was nice and high, but then I switched gears and I started doing more, lower intensity stuff. It was still moving a lot, so everything was still in play and you weren't having loss of organ function in other ways, then it's probably just a matter of where the actual deficit is occurring in terms of that. What are some ways that people can improve their VO2 max that are really kind of tried and tested? I mean, it's one of the things that I do personally. Like I love Norwegian 4x4. Like I feel like the evidence is pretty strong on that, just by kind of pushing that sort of moderate length interval, versus like a 1 minute where you're just pushing it really hard. That's where I've seen the best improvement. But what have you seen in the lab, and what have you seen just in the other literature? Yeah,
so there are, as you mentioned, the Norwegian style training with the 4 on 4 off is pretty common and something that's very commonly employed in the exercise physiology literature for exercise training studies. Martin Gabala, some other people have pushed all the way in the other end of the spectrum of doing 10-second sprints. And I even had a colleague, I don't remember where he did this, but I think they were doing 2, 3, or 4 second sprints.
Wow.
They had to do 40 of them on the bike. But if you think about the sort of load over time of that high intensity range, So with the Norwegian, maybe you're obviously not at 100, and maybe you're in that 80 to 90 range percent. So if you think about like load over time at levels above 80% of your maximum, and then you think about the sprint interval training with 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and then the other study that I'm a little bit less familiar with, but there is a study exists that 2, 3, or 4 second sprints repeated 40 times.
Is that with 2 to 3 seconds off too?
I don't remember the. I
Suck.
I don't remember the intervals for rest.
Yeah. I would much rather do
punt on that
Norwegian 4x4 than doing 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's a little bit of a different system because that's really training your PCR, your fast twitch system right away, and you probably all the magic is happening in between those rest intervals. When you sprint really hard, everything feels great. Then you get your recovery period, and then all of a sudden that catches up to you, and you start breathing really heavy, and then the next sprint happens. And then you're just in this very anaerobic state for a while. But I think really any of those, you could compare studies. There are different populations, different intervention lengths, and different starting points as far as training status for these people. But all of those will still increase VO2 max if you're not doing them typically. For myself, just from the variability that I've seen, I've personally been a little bit less stringent with doing interval training myself. So there's the idea of the classic, fartlek training for running, for example. And I actually told a buddy that I was starting to do some of that training, and he quickly was telling me like, oh, no, you're not doing it right because you're timing it. You're supposed to go by feel. And I said, I actually went by feel. So it's basically just pushing yourself at a pretty hard intensity until you feel like you can't hold it any longer, and then taking a rest for long enough until you feel like you can go pretty hard for a little bit of time. So I think anything along that spectrum, if you really like the time efficiency, then the 5 to 10 minute warm up, 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, or if you want to do that sort of more Tabata styles training. But the Martin Gabala style would be 20 second sprint, I believe every 2 minutes, repeated 3 times, I think is most common. And it could be doing more, obviously, or the Norwegian sort of style of 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. I really think all of those will still drive a VO2 max, and then it's just up to you whether or not you want to manipulate things in a way where you get that extra 1 or 2 points on that VO2 max.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think a lot about the 80-20 rule, 80% of the benefits, and you'll get there with any of those styles. You can kind of just pick what works best for you, and whether you like to do rowing or cycling or running up a hill, those types of things. So there's a lot of variability with the things you could do.
Yeah, I'm with you on the fartlek training too, though. It's a lot more entertaining, and I mean, because your RPE is going to count for something, and I think that factors in a lot of other things that time can't account for when you're doing like a Norwegian 4x4. And there's some days where it's just not going to cut it. Like the idea of doing 4 minutes of something, you're just maybe not in that headspace. But I used to do it with like telephone pole intervals where it would just like, it was sort of like a variation of fartleks, but where it would be like, okay, it's either going to be 1 telephone pole length or 2 telephone pole lengths or 3 telephone pole lengths. And so that would gamify it a little bit, but it's just like if I was feeling really cruddy that day and it wasn't going to fly, it might just be 1 telephone pole length, right? But it's like, and maybe I'd be pushing it a little bit harder, but 2 telephone pole lengths was like, okay, cool, like I could do it. And then some days I felt really good, it would be 3, but the relative exertion was usually about the same. And it just shows that even at an elite level versus a non-elite level, like each day is going to be wildly different.
Right.
2 kind of follow-up questions on that. Like 1, how important do you see like rest in between those intervals mattering for VO2 max? Like, because and this gets into a little bit of a different territory that might be slightly outside your scope. And if it's one that's hard for you to answer, in that case, totally okay. But with interval training, it's always been sort of my idea that you want to be able to maximize your rest so that you can really give it your all in your interval. Like, and I don't really necessarily care how long it takes to rest, right? But when you start getting into an elite level, of course, the more fatigued you are entering into an interval, you're probably improving VO2 max more, as well as other lactate clearance and all these other things. But does the rest time really matter above a certain point? Like as long as you're mostly recovered, does it really matter?
Yeah, I'm not too sure directly. Just as an anecdote, I used to have a buddy who was a pretty big power lifter, and lifting with him was pretty challenging for me because I like to be pretty time efficient.
I'm the same way. I love those guys, but like when he
would do a lift and then disappear for 15 minutes, and I'd be thinking we're ready to do exercise number 3 for the day, and he'd be ready for set number 2.
Yeah.
But you love all different aspects of what people have with their goals. But I think it just depends. Maybe when you're trying to optimize performance, for example, I guess as a leeway from that, where if you care about your 200 meter track time, maybe you want to be a little bit more recovered to do your next bout to make sure you meet that time. Whereas maybe earlier on in the training cycle, you want to really be pushing and driving those adaptations, and you want to get your body used to buffering that acidic environment that you're building and getting used to being high rate of breathing, high heart rate, and someone says go again and you're not ready, but then you just do it. And there's probably some psychological changes too, as you're just getting used to just running and running and running. But I would agree with you that I think the rest interval times, obviously you can use any of those like prescribed interval things that we talked about before with the 10 seconds, 20 or 4 minutes on and off. But honestly, I think that so long as you feel like, as you said, do you feel like you're recovered enough to do a good bout and you're not just consistently decline, where you go from, interval number 1 and interval number 10, it's going to be lower. But if it's 60% lower, then depending on your goals, maybe you should have just kept it a little bit longer rest intervals.
Yeah. It's, you know who Chris Hinshaw is? He's like a high level coach, mainly he's been on the CrossFit side for a long time, but he works mainly with special operations now. But he's very, very big on building base, right, and all these things. And I think what I can't help but think is, your ability to recover in between intervals is probably a little bit more dependent on, your base, right, which may or may not influence your VO2 max all that much. So it's like if someone has, like in your experience, if someone can go all out for 3 minutes, but takes 5 minutes to recover, and you have person B that can go push it just as hard for 3 minutes, maybe even harder, but takes 5 minutes to recover, like, would you typically see a difference in VO2 max between those people, or does it really matter? Is the VO2 max really just when you're pushing at that intensity, and it doesn't really matter how long the person takes to recover, at least in an athlete? Because I'm sure in a general population, if they're not recovering, it's probably indicative of a poor VO2 max. But
yeah, I mean, if you think about what, again, the VO2 max is actually measuring, it's the maximal oxygen uptake rate. And what I think the difference between those people would be somebody who can handle that load and deal with it a little bit better. They might be the person that gets to stage 9 of an exercise test and their VO2 max has plateaued. So their VO2, let's say, is 50. Then they go to the next stage and their VO2 is still 50. Maybe they push through another stage and they're used to being very anaerobic. Whereas another person gets to stage 9, they get to 50 and they feel terrible and they stop right away.
Yeah.
But one of the other criteria for VO2 max test is that the oxygen consumption rate should plateau. And some of that variability that you might be speaking to is sort of how well or how much people can deal with those really anaerobic stages of the exercise test where you're sort of in a deficit. You're not really driving anything other than just more metabolic byproducts at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about the other question was, does hydration play a role in this? Like if you're dehydrated, you're not able to really. I notice when I'm dehydrated, I don't breathe as well. Like things just aren't as fluid. Have you noticed anything there? Like if people are dehydrated, does that impact, or how much of a role does that play in general?
Yeah, so for VO2 max, usually hydrating can be beneficial, I guess, relative to just being unprepared, ensuring that you're hydrated may have a slight benefit. And I don't know how to quantify that. It'll vary a little bit between people. But being dehydrated can definitely reduce your VO2 max by a little bit. One thing would be related to obviously blood volume. If you have less blood circulating, then it's going to be harder to get more of it out to the tissues.
That would make sense.
From a simple point of view. But yeah, hydration is something that we check for all of our studies, even those that don't include VO2 max, just because it is. If someone's very dehydrated, that can impact a lot of things related to the physiology.
What about muscle mass? Because obviously muscle is going to soak up a heck of a lot of stuff, right? A lot of oxygen, demand a lot of oxygen. Is it pretty par for the course to see someone that has more muscle mass, usually with a lower VO2 max? Or is it like, again, all kind of relative because you're looking at that oxygen cascade?
Yeah, I mean, it'll depend if they're an endurance trained person or a power lifter type person. Obviously, everything sort of in between. But if you think about the VO2 max is actually measuring, it's oxygen per kilogram of body weight. So if you have somebody who's leaner, then they're going to have more muscle mass relative to their body mass. So that means that they're going to have more of that, oxygen sponge relative to their weight. So their relative VO2 max might be a little better. But there's also an absolute VO2. So that is, let's say that you and I did a VO2 max test, and we both had a VO2 of 4 liters per minute, not indexed to body weight. And it could be that that's the same value, but let's say that you weighed 20 pounds more than me, then your VO2 max relative value would be lower. So that would come out as like a worse outcome. But just talking about that idea. So for example, some of these larger people that we tested with a lot of muscle mass, they might get to 5 liters per minute of VO2, which is very high, and it is quite high. But if you index it to their body mass, their VO2 max value doesn't come out to be that much higher. Whereas someone who's very light and very lean, if they have 4 liters per minute, when you index it to their smaller body weight, they might actually have a better VO2 max. So there is that sort of interaction. And for that reason, sometimes we express things in VO2 max per ideal body weight. So if someone has obesity or has excess adiposity, we might also look at that as a marker of sort of how they're doing, independent of just the non-metabolically active adipose tissue that they just happen to be carrying around.
Interesting. Okay, I've got a question on the RER side of things with this, and this gets to a little bit of my own experience. When I last VO2 max test I did was with Andy Galpin about a year ago, and I didn't cross a 1 RER until like the very, very end.
Interesting.
Now I'm, at the time I wasn't, but I mean, 12 years pretty much straight of a ketogenic diet, doing lots of endurance work. Imagine like highly fat adapted to the point where maybe that was the case, and almost always trained fasted. And I was training in this case fasted. So I think I crossed a 1 RER in like the last minute, right? And then after I finished the VO2 max, then, it went well above 1. A, do you see that? B, or do you see that ever so often? B, like, what does that really indicate in your experience? And C, do you look at RER as an indicator for like metabolic issues? And some people like, hey, like you reach this VO2 max and you're well above a 1 early on, or like, does it tell you? What else does it tell you?
Yeah, so I guess first to start with the RER, the respiratory exchange ratio. It's simply the VCO2 over VO2, and the V is the rate of carbon dioxide production from the body over the rate of oxygen uptake. So when the RER is above 1, that simply means that you're at a deficit essentially. So your body is working harder than aerobic metabolism could handle at that time. And just to give people some values, the 1.0, so that's used for a lot of times clinical populations and maybe not necessarily sedentary, but people that are probably less likely to be exercise trained. So you would call it a good VO2 max test if they surpass 1.0. Mm-hmm. And as you get more trained, it could be that the 1.1 or 1.2 is more indicative of a valid test because they can often reach that higher RER value. So independent of, I think, fat adaptation, I think it still sort of holds true that surpassing 1 is still pretty important to show that you've surpassed or maxed out your aerobic metabolism, because that test is really trying to tell you that. And it's just some of those people had to have that special gift to just push on with an RER above 1 or 1.1 or 1.2 for a stage or 2. Mm-hmm. That was kind of interesting that we were alluding to a little bit before.
Yeah, it's because I would say what my limiting factor was just leg fatigue. Ultimately, it was like it felt like lungs kind of had more, but I've also experienced. I mean, I've run marathon distance fasted. I mean, that's not really hard for me. And Andy's take was he's like he kind of laughed and was like you're like carbohydrate intolerant. He's like you're like having a hard time actually shifting into that, because I could tell when he was running the test, he was just like, this is interesting. Like every other marker is telling me that you're gassed and you're done, but you're not at a 1 RER, which is interesting, But I mean, who knows? It could have been different if I was carb fueled before. But then again, if I'm carbon tolerant, not literally carbon tolerant, but probably have a lower level of glucose tolerance, at least at that time, since I wasn't ingesting a lot of carbohydrates just as a whole. Where are some like resources that you would recommend for people like to find, ways to increase VO2 max and things like that? I know we talked a little bit, I don't know the details of it, Rhonda Patrick just released some cool stuff. I mean, what would you recommend people look to?
Yeah, Rhonda Patrick and Brady Halmer just co-released, I think it's howtotrainguide.com, which is cool that URL was available, so it was a good find on their end. But they have a PDF that sort of lays out some of those training regimens and also some other practical tips related to some of the things that you brought up today. So how long should I recover? So it talks about VO2 max training, zone 2 training, and I think they even included resistance training as well. And I just had skimmed it at this point because it was just released last week, I think. But they have things like supersetting considerations for that, rest period intervals, and specific to certain goals that you might have. So that'd be a decent resource. But I guess for VO2 max, as I mentioned, really just starting for now with any sort of intervals that make sense for you with whatever equipment that you might have probably will cause a great benefit right away, especially if you're not doing those things right now. And the cherry on top is just if you want to sort of optimize and control those things a little bit more, if that's what you're looking to do.
Right on, man. Well, Dr. Watso, where can everyone find you, man?
Yeah, so I'm at Florida State University, so I have a profile there, but I most often keep my lab website up to date. That's caplaboratory.com, CAP Laboratory. And there we have information about the research team, the articles that we publish in different areas in exercise physiology, cardiovascular health, nutrition, things like that. We also have some lay articles. So if there's really cool science that gets published or some things that I see at a conference that I think is interesting and actionable for people, then I usually write up short blurbs about it so they can just view that, skim that, and get a few takeaways that might benefit them. Or if they're curious about the knowledge, there's some physiology in there too.
Perfect. Right on, my man. Thanks, brother.
Yeah.